During the time the class of 1941 attended Regis, the school was headed by Reverend Coleman Nevels. He was appointed to Regis in 1935. He arrived after serving 2 very successful terms as president of Georgetown, where he played a pivotal role in expanding the Jesuit university.
There was a point up until the mid to late 60s that one person, one man, Jesuit, had, I believe, 5 roles. He was the pastor of St. Ignatius, he was the rector of Regis, he was the rector of Loyola, he was the head of the elementary school, he was often the superior of the community. So the rector here at Regis through the 50s, he had an office here, but from when I've interviewed people, came in the building occasionally. So in the early years, the rector, what we probably would have called president, had minimal involvement in the school. That changed dramatically by the 70s, where the title became president, and the president-principal model was kind of enshrined here, as well as most other Jesuit high schools and other private schools. The school was really run, and I believe this title changed a bit, by the prefect of studies or the principal. Then it was called the headmaster, and then it was called the principal.
The prefect of studies was Father Daniel Burke. He was only 33 years old when he was appointed to the role, also in 1935. Father Burke grew up in North Bronx and was an alumnus from Regis' second graduating class in 1919. Father Burke was also known to have had an inexhaustible amount of good humor and a great zest for life. But he also had the power to strike fear in hearts, while as principal and later in the military. Those who knew Father Burke said that his occasional severity was rooted in direct truthfulness. The class of 41 had a gentle preview of that on their first day at Regis, when he starkly announced to the gathered boys that only half of them would graduate.
This even goes back to the time when I was a student. The faculty was certainly smaller than the faculty is today. The curriculum was more heavily linguistic. For example, I took Latin, 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, and 2 years of French, as well as taking English and math and so on. Science was more limited. It was beginning to become more a significant part of the curriculum. In fact, in my time here, I think in my senior year,
Jesuits made up a large portion of the teaching staff.
Actually, one other thing that was true 50 years ago, less true today, is you would often find individual teachers teaching a multiplicity of subjects, at least especially the Jesuit scholastics who were teaching, would often be teaching 3 different subjects. I mean, Latin, Greek, and theology, or Latin, English, and theology, or something along those lines. So they did teach, we didn't have quite the discipline focus that we find in most schools today.
Teachers were also completely men in the early decades.
Before, roughly 1965, 68, almost all of them, there were a couple of women who worked here, librarians. There was a part-time art teacher in the 50s. But really the idea of hiring women to teach in an all-boys school was kind of not common. But all those social mores, traditions began to change with all the tremendous change that came in the 1960s, both from within the church because of the council, and then beyond the church because of the tumult and of the late 1960s, with such a young generation, the baby boomer generations coming into young adulthood.
One teacher's name in particular would come up repeatedly amongst the class of 41 boys even after they graduated. Father Gabriel Zema's story is very much a part of the class of 1941.
Zema was here, at least 15 or 20 years. He clearly had a very profound impact on the boys.
Father Gabriel Archangel Zema was born on July 29, 1891 in the little village of Arno in the province of Calabria in southern Italy. He was a Calabrese in the full sense of the word, sharing with them their vigor, determination, and its less attractive cousin, hard-headedness.
In 1900, while on his migrant voyage across the Atlantic on the SS Tartar Prince, 8-year-old Gabriel fell deathly ill, and no one seemed to know why. It was serious enough that the crew and his family even made preparations to bury him at sea. The story Father Zema liked to tell in later years was that God had other plans for him. Thus, he miraculously recovered. However, when relating the event, he would also add one caveat, that his sister eventually revealed that young Gabriel actually blacked out after drinking a whole bottle of Marsala wine he had found on board. The Zema family would settle in the Lower East Side in a tenement home not far from the original St. Patrick's Cathedral. Father Zema would recall that growing up, most of his neighbors were poor, illiterate immigrants of peasant stock. Many didn't speak English and were unfamiliar with the ways of those in the new country. Even in church, they were only allowed to attend services in the basement, away from the more fortunate and better dressed parishioners upstairs. It was one of his earliest recognitions of the injustice of poverty and class distinction. Gabriel's path to becoming a Jesuit was not a smooth one. His father was against it, as Gabriel's older brother had already turned to the priesthood. It was only shortly before his death when Gabriel's father would finally accept his vocation. His calling was also almost thwarted by the First World War.
It was the most trying time of my life, and I stormed heaven for guidance and help.
Gabriel was ordered to the local draft board, but it turned out he was too light and too short for the military. It would earn him the nickname Shorty. Gabriel began his novitiate training to join the Jesuit Society at age 26. He was several years older than his peers when he entered St. Andrew-on-Hudson. He sometimes felt out of place amongst others who had just finished high school. It also didn't help that Gabriel was already sensitive about his height. While Gabriel was a fine religious man, he was an unremarkable student, and often found classes there dreary. Later, he would lament those trying times when one particular teacher would regularly pick on him for his ridicule.
It would have helped if this teacher had joined a bit of gentleness to his scorching severity.
But Gabriel would benefit greatly from those difficult experiences.
Vidi Dominum. I know myself so much better now. There's lots of work ahead.
His biographer would later write that he who was such a disappointing pupil was to be a patient, sympathetic, and beloved teacher. Father Zema would spend 17 years at Regis, and he was a very popular teacher amongst the students. He was called a veritable dynamo, and he was seemingly tireless. Besides his regular duties as a teacher, Father Zema was widely credited with work on the Regis Library, the Guard of Honor program, and above all, it would be his work with alumni that would perhaps have the longest lasting impact on Regis. Father Zema would remain a friend to many of the 1941 boys well after they graduated. He frequently corresponded with many during the Second World War and visited them in hospitals when they were wounded in service. There were also numerous references of him baptizing their children, presiding over weddings, and even assisting in the ordinations of those who joined the religious.